Okay, we've got the PowerPoint presentation we're going to be going through. Now, one thing that I really want to stress is the PowerPoint presentation and the PMBOK guide alone is sufficient to pass the test. You really need to be using these as guides as to what you need to dig into. And really lean on your mentors because they've got a better idea of what's going to be necessary. They're at least in touch with people who may have already taken the new exam. So use every resource that you can within AT&T to make sure that you have a great chance of passing. And as Will said, that's the overall goal for all of us here. Okay. So we're going to be talking about starting the project. There'll be two objectives that we have today. And it's going to be to determine the appropriate project methodology or methods and practices and plan and manage scope. And in the ECO task numbers are out of the outline for the current test and volume 6 of PMBOK guide. So that's your key reference right there. So
you're not sharing. Did you mean to be?
I'm not sharing? Of course, not to be sharing.
Thank you.
Oh. Yeah. I guess the mind meld isn't working, huh? Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Well, can you see that? Okay.
Thank you.
Good enough. Okay, thanks for reminding me. Appreciate that. So the two objectives, as I said, were to assess the project needs, determine the complexity of the project and how big it is, and pick the proper methodology or method and the practices that are going to result in a well-managed project. And then we're going to talk about planning and managing the scope of the project. Okay. The enablers that we're going to be talking about are assessing the project needs, complexity, and magnitude, recommending project execution strategy, and they give two examples, contracting and finance. Why are you doing this project? Are you going to be contracting out part of the project? Things like that. And also, how does finance deal with your project so that you have a good idea of how it's funded and what risks you're going to be running with that. Recommend a project methodology and approach. The three that they talk about throughout the PMI literature are predictive, and you'll see predictive. It's the equivalent of what we've called waterfall around here for years. Agile, and then hybrid, which is a combination of the two, agile and predictive. So the final enabler is to use iterative incremental practices throughout the project life cycle. So we'll dive into the definitions of iterative and incremental practices a little bit later today. This is along the same lines as every presentation that you'll see here. We have deliverables and tools. The deliverables are creating a survey, and we'll get into that a little bit later. We'll have a deliverable of the project business case and needs documentation, project overview statement, project implementation plan, and Agile practice guidelines. Now, there may be additional deliverables that are required by your particular organization, whether it's within AT&T or outside of AT&T. So, but this is the core set of deliverables as outlined by PMI. We'll talk about all these tools in depth, but just the list is expert judgment, meetings, focus groups, workshops, creating SMART objectives, and we all remember what SMART stands for, right? Specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, time-based objectives. And this is true about anything that we're putting together that is time-based. You need to have your knowledge of classic project management and Agile practices. There are classes that are available through the Agile COE, and I believe there are or will be additional classes available through PLE that can give you a foundation in Agile and at least get you involved with the community that can help answer questions too. Okay. The other tool that they mentioned is project integration. PMI says that Agile is a modern approach where teams work collectively with the customer to determine the project needs. Now, some places have been unconsciously using Agile practices for decades. We've made it, we formalized the approach with a number of different products that are used. And it really boils down to what they say here, where the customer is more involved with the project all along the way, rather than just in the generation of requirements. Okay. And the key here is that the coordination of the customer, the interaction of the customer and the team drives the project forward. What that means is that you don't have everything planned out to, from start to finish, that how the customer reacts to what has been delivered already will help determine what the team does next. So that's what they mean by drives the project forward. So there'll be add-on work to that. You may have heard some terms like minimum viable project or product, or minimum marketable feature. What we're talking about there is just getting something out to the customer that they can put their hands on, that they can see how things work, and then engage with the customer and determine what their reaction is to that and find out if there are changes that need to be made. Okay. For predictive or plan-driven, this is waterfall type. It's the traditional approach where everything is done up front. And the plan itself is what you work against. Now, some of the drawbacks of the predictive projects, unless it's something that has been done time after time after time, and you know what the requirements are, and you know what the constraints are, and you know how long it's going to take, then you always have the possibility of a surprise at the end when you deliver the final product to the customer and they say, well, that's not really what I can use. So this is, historically, this has led to a lot of, especially software projects, being, ending up not being used. With millions invested in development, turns out that IT teams are pretty darn good at developing things that the customer didn't want. So, and also requirements change. If you've got an 18-month project, halfway down the line, there's significant change, such as we saw with COVID-19 hitting. You've got to be able to react to that. And we'll get into it more later, but having a large change control process can actually hinder progress with this. Now, hybrid is where you combine the two. PMI, and these are the definitions that you need to really memorize, understand, and use, that the project may switch approaches based on need, changing work requirements, or circumstances. We also use a hybrid process or hybrid method when we have, say, a vendor who is working in a predictive paradigm, and we're working Agile methodology, where we have to establish times where we're going to meet with the deliverables. So if you've got some teams running a hybrid methodology, some teams running Agile, that's where you have, some teams running predictive, some Agile, you end up with a hybrid. Now, talk about business case and business needs documents. You really need to understand the difference between a business case and business needs. And it's interesting to me that they mention the business needs after the business case, and let you know that the business needs documents are written prior to the formal business case. So we'll go backwards, as they say here. But the business case really lays out, what the economic feasibility is for this project, how much is going to have to be invested over what period of time, what the expected return is, and how long it's going to take to pay off the investment itself. When you get the business case completed, you have a list of the benefits of the various components of the project, so that you use it as a sales tool within the organization to obtain funding and authorization to begin a project. And it provides a basis for the authorization of future project activities. So if you lay it out that the business case is that you put out an initial product in 18 months, and then the plan is to follow it up with some major enhancements over the period of 2 years, that would all be documented in your business case. Okay. So business needs is kind of like the opposite. Business needs are what the customer really needs and what the plan is to provide those high-level deliverables that are going to satisfy the customer. As I said, it's written prior to the formal business case, and it describes what needs to be created and what needs to be performed. Either one could be zero. So if it's a services only, business case, there may not need for anything to be created. If it is deliverables only, a lot of new product to be created. You may not have any external performing that needs to be done, depending on things like whether or not the customer needs training, project management, or anything like that. So most of your cases are going to be having both. So you need to describe what needs to be created, what needs to be performed. Next comes the project implementation plan. As in classic waterfall or predictive, deliverables may be delivered all at once at the end of the project. For Agile, especially, project outputs are delivered throughout the project so that the customer can see what has been implemented so far and request any changes that are necessary. Okay. Some questions to ask when you're delivering outputs. You need to consider asking if these outputs will be implemented in a new business environment or in an existing business environment. When will they be transitioned to a live environment rather than just a testing or a staging environment? What's going to be done about decommissioning or removing the old system, the processes, or materials? Because remember, this applies across the board. It's not just software. It's also civil engineering type projects where you're building roads or buildings, and virtually anything that would require project management. And ensuring that the training and knowledge transfer is complete is satisfactory. Now, these are the bounds that you need to establish when you're initially talking with the customer. Okay. In the project implementation plan, you need to consider all the stakeholders, schedules, risks, budgets, and quality standards. Okay. So stakeholders include both the members of the team in your organization, your leadership. The other stakeholders are on the customer side. Oh, well, it can be on the customer side. It can also be a vendor, one or more vendors who are contributing to the overall project. Okay. Now, going through an assessment of project needs, complexity, and magnitude, there are several different methodologies that can be considered. And this matrix really talks about all of the ones that they outlined a few slides ago: Agile, Predictive, Iterative, Incremental, and Hybrid. So that key things to remember are the bullet points here. With Agile, changes are relatively easy, waste isn't costly. Reason for that is that you're using ideally 2-week sprints, so that even if you're going way off the rails, that you're going to be able to recover and change with minimum financial impact. Okay. And Agile methods are great when it's a very complex environment and you don't really fully understand what the end product needs to be. So you rely on the feedback from the end user, from the customer, to help form the final product that you're delivering. So predictive or plan driven. If you've got changes that are expensive due to scrap and waste, this is when you're looking at to me, this is that any changes to a predictive or plan-driven project really costs a lot more because you end up with a lot of scrap and you end up with a lot of waste. You've got sunk costs in everything that you've done already. So the sunk cost that delivery time is huge compared with an Agile project where sunk cost is basically 2 weeks worth of effort. Because that's how often you should ideally be interacting with the customer. Okay. For an iterative methodology, if you've got dynamic requirements and the customer wants and is willing to take small, frequent deliveries, so that we're looking at speed as a major goal for that. Then with the hybrid, we'll use it when there's some costs that they're going to be applied to any changes where stakeholders are interested in another method but not comfortable in adopting it. Hybrid is also used, as I said, if you've got a vendor who is running a different method, using a different methodology than the project that you're managing. Okay. And then the examples, for Agile software projects or projects based on intellectual property and research. You can also use Agile methods for any project, really. It needs to be architected properly. It needs to be managed properly. And you have to have the buy-in from the entire team to do it right. Okay. So predictive or plan-driven, construction projects or projects that have a lot of physical assets, the establishment of putting together a server farm, things like that have been done over and over and over. You have an idea how much it's going to cost, how much time it's going to take, and what the results are. And you don't need to wrap up the customer with any questions or anything like that unless there's a huge problem from beginning to end of implementation. Iterative projects where learning and correction is expected to eventually get to the ideal solution. So iterative and incremental are two subcategories of Agile, actually. The example that I've always used with for iterative or with Agile projects is say you're trying to place a spacecraft in orbit around a planet or a moon. With predictive or plan-driven methodology, what you're going to do is make sure that you have everything absolutely perfect before you launch the rocket. And you'll find out whether your calculations were correct if it makes it into orbit around whatever planet or moon that you're shooting at. With iterative or Agile, what you do is you continually assess progress along the way and make any corrections based on the best knowledge that you have at that moment. It may not be perfect knowledge, but at least you're maintaining being on target. So, and rather than having like one huge massive correction when you're overshooting something or undershooting something, that you really have at times thousands of checks to make sure that the characteristics of the launch and the shot are proper to get you into orbit. Okay. The incremental projects where customers and business really want to see something all the time. You know, it's sometimes like when the kids are in the back seat saying, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And you're just opening the garage door to leave. And then the hybrid projects with a mixed level of mixed resources and experience levels, or projects seeking or willing to learn new methods or techniques. It's saying, you know, do it partially the way you're used to it, and then also explore the new method. We're going to hit some definitions here, especially coming up. Now, these are all taken from PMBOK Guide of Knowledge, 6th edition, and that's noted on your slides. So, PMI just published the 7th edition of the PMBOK Guide. I haven't read it yet. I don't know if any of these definitions have changed. But if you're taking the test at the end of this series of presentations, you should be fine with what's in the 6th edition. These slides should be updated whenever the test has been updated too. So right now, plan on these slides being your guide. The first one was progressive elaboration. That's really documenting the best that you know at any given time, and then exploring and finding out what more and more detail about what you need to do or what the product how it has to perform, when it has to go to the customer, things like that. So what you're doing is you're starting from a blank slate, and you put down your initial thoughts, and you keep evolving that until you've got something that is really workable, and make sure it's back there in your project plan. Okay, they list the types of life cycles: predictive, adaptive, and hybrid. Okay, now, this is an expansion on the one that they did earlier, where they just mentioned Agile, predictive, Agile, and hybrid. So under adaptive, understand that Iterative, Incremental, and Agile are all adaptive life cycles. And also know there's predictive and hybrids in there too. Okay, predictive life cycle. We're going to have a lot of definitions, we'll have types and characteristics, and we'll keep expanding on that. So predictive life cycle is a form of project life cycle in which the project scope, time, and costs are determined in the early phases of the life cycle. So we predict how much it's going to cost, how long it's going to take, what it's going to involve up front, and then assess against that at the deliveries. As I said, a lot of this use of predictive project management of things like roads, buildings, things like that, where it's the same, you're going through the same process multiple times, and you have a really good idea of all the parameters. Okay. So predictive, you have fixed requirements. The activities are performed once per project. You have a single delivery, and your goal is to manage cost. So an iterative life cycle is a project life cycle where the project scope is generally determined early in the project life cycle. The time and cost estimates are routinely modified as the project team's understanding of the product increases. Key points here is that you don't know everything up front, where your requirements are generally known, but they're by no means refined enough to specify everything that has to take place. So the characteristics here: dynamic requirements. Activities are repeated until they're correct. Okay, so the customer, assesses along the way. There is a single delivery, and the overall goal here is the correct solution. So know the goals, know what the characteristics are for each of the types. So an incremental life cycle is an adaptive project life cycle in which the deliverable is produced through a series of iterations that successively add functionality within a predetermined time frame. So we're talking like the 2-week intervals, 2-week sprints. The deliverable contains the necessary and sufficient capability to be considered complete only after the final iteration. So here's in adaptive, we've got the characteristics of iterative and incremental. So incremental is dynamic requirements again, activities performed once per increment, and you have frequent small deliveries. Your overall goal is speed at the expense of expense or time. Yeah. Agile life cycles. A project life cycle that is iterative or incremental, also referred to as change-driven or adaptive. Yeah. So again, you have dynamic requirements, combines iterative repetition of activities with incremental deliveries. So you deliver often, you deliver incrementally. You add functionality each time you deliver. You consult with the customer, assess whether or not the changes that you've made over the last iteration have satisfied the customer requirements, or if they haven't, why haven't they? And then you structure your subsequent deliverables based on the assessments. You go through this assessment like every sprint, and as I said, ideally every 2 weeks. And what you're really trying to do here is maximize the customer value of what's produced. Give the most back to the customer. Okay. So hybrid. It includes adaptive and predictive components. It's shorter. It has shorter than a predictive project. It utilizes the iterative time frames. So say a 2-week sprint or a 3-week sprint. There's a lot of stakeholder involvement, and you've got more in-depth requirements. As we said too, it also combines predictive and adaptive. It has both of those characteristics. Okay. I do not have an activity. So we're going to go into topic B, plan and manage scope. And I forgot to mention we do have a lot of slides to cover tonight. So if we move along okay, we'll be able to take a short break at 6 o'clock 6 o'clock Central if the team's interested. Okay, enablers. Determine and prioritize requirements. You'll hear things like methods to use to prioritize requirements. You may have heard of something called WSJF, or weighted shortest job first. There are other ways to prioritize requirements too. Break down scope and define acceptance criteria. The example they give is definition of done, and that exists at many levels. Whether it's definition of done on what you deliver to the customer, or whether it's definition of done for internal handoffs. It's an agreement with all the parties involved, so there are really no surprises when the team, states that something's ready to be handed off. To be building work packages and doing some minimal amount of work as a proof of concept. And then to be monitoring, reprioritizing, and validating scope. Okay, again, we have deliverables and tools. The deliverables are going to be a requirements register, or we used to call it a requirements traceability matrix, work performance reports, and traceability matrix. Yeah. Tools used are Agile estimating, having a product backlog. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, especially. You need to document whatever the change requests process is, and go through change requests to change any documentation. Updating the requirements document. We'll update the product backlog, and again, we'll use some method of prioritizing it, and we'll update the project management plan. So let's talk a little bit about the scope management plan. And again, know what the definition is. Component of the project management plan or program management plan that describes how the scope will be defined, developed, monitored, controlled, and validated. So this keeps establishes the boundaries that the scope has to exist within. So the tools and techniques, expert judgment, both internal and external experts. There are some projects where you may be able to go out to the industry, get some expert opinions as to for some of the questions that you have. There's alternative analysis. You can use the data analysis method. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And one of the big tools is meetings, where you're going to be meeting a good deal with the team members who are involved in creating the scope management plan. And realize too, you're going to be talking to leadership and to possibly to the end customer. Okay. Project requirements, the agreed upon conditions or capabilities of a product, service, or outcome that the project is designed to satisfy. High-level requirements, characteristics, high-level requirements might be documented in the project charter. The project manager must verify all requirements are determined and documented, and realize this is to the best of your ability at that point in time. It is quite likely that you're going to find out about other requirements as the project matures. So realize that going in, that you're going to have to go through whatever change process you've agreed to in order to make sure that you satisfy what the customer needs. And then the requirements are also used as the foundation for building the work breakdown structure. Okay. Document analysis is a technique used to gain project requirements from current documentation evaluation, so that I mean, especially if you're working a civil engineering project and it's the umpteenth time that your organization has done it, you should have some pretty robust documentation that you can take a look at and analyze, and make sure that your project specifically would meet, be able to use some of those techniques especially in estimating. Okay. And you can derive new project requirements from existing business plans, service agreements, marketing materials, process diagrams, and application software documentation. So it's really going through existing documentation and trying to find out any other requirements that may have been necessary in the past and really need to be included in anything today. Use of focus groups. Focus group is an elicitation technique, or you go out and ask people, that brings together pre-qualified stakeholders and subject matter experts to learn about their expectations and attitudes about a proposed product, service, or result. Okay. They're designed to be information sharing sessions and use less of a structure than some other meetings. One of the big keys is you can get the most out of a focus group if you have a trained monitor, a person who's trained in getting information from a focus group. Because at times you have to reach out to people and just to get them to talk about their requirements. Yeah. So in your focus group, you want to have your stakeholders and subject matter experts in the focus groups. They are a form of qualitative research. You're going to get desires here. You're going to find out, what the customer is expecting too. Use questionnaires and surveys. So a questionnaire is a written set of questions designed to quickly accumulate information from a large number of respondents. Realize, especially internally, to AT&T, you may or may not get back a large number of responses. And the questionnaires and surveys, we've generally used something like SurveyMonkey for that, where you can create a survey, show them some graphics, and then collect the information from them. We also use benchmarking, and benchmarking is a great technique, and it's the comparison of actual or planned products, processes, and practices to those comparable organizations. To those of comparable organizations, in order to identify best practices, generate ideas for improvement, and provide a basis for measuring performance. Now, it's ideal if you can benchmark several organizations. They don't have to all be external. They can be some internal, depending on the size of the organization you're a member of. But it's always great to try and include in your benchmarking the results of some of the leaders in the technology that you're trying to benchmark, so that if you're looking at something like cloud computing, you take a look at IBM, you take a look at Yahoo, you'll take a look at Google in order to see what they're doing well and how you measure up to them. And boils down to that they're used to identify best practices in order to meet or exceed the best practices. Okay, questionnaires, written set of questions designed to quickly accumulate information from a large number of respondents. Now realize that if you send out questionnaires and or surveys, it may or may not be successful within AT&T. I've seen where we only get sometimes 5 to 20% of the people involved with the project who will return the surveys or the questionnaires. So just realize that you may have to follow up if you use techniques such as this, and make sure that you get at least some people who you haven't had exposure to whatever change you're talking about or whatever product you're talking about, and assess what they have, what they desire, and it may take one-on-one interactions. I think that's in there twice. Yep. Interviews, formal or informal approach to elicit information from stakeholders by talking with them directly. This is very time consuming. Sometimes it'll take well over half an hour per person. It's best to have structured questions going into this, but it helps to identify the stakeholders' individual requirements, goals, expectations related to the project. Now, you really need, it's really best if you have a trained or experienced interviewer. You really want to get the stakeholders to expand on the initial responses and make sure that all of these points are covered, like requirements, goals, expectations. Okay? And doing this aids in identifying and defining the features and functions of the desired project deliverables. So really, you're talking to people. Okay? That's it's more and more of what we end up doing within project management is being a what can I say? A transfer point for information. So you need to be talking continuously to leadership. You need to be talking continuously to the development teams, continuously to other project managers who are working on the same deliverables, and really keeping abreast of any metrics changes, things like that, so that rather than really getting bogged down in data entry the way that project managers have been doing around here for a number of years, that what we're proposing is something that is going to take well, it takes time up front. It results in some better spelled out requirements. Okay. Now, decision making is another tool. These are just different types of how decisions are made. Unanimity is everybody has to agree. Majority is one person above the half has to agree. Plurality is if most people agree. Then autocratic is the decisions made by somebody, usually within leadership. Data representation, they show a couple of techniques, mind mapping and affinity diagrams. So mind mapping is a technique used to consolidate ideas created through individual brainstorming sessions into a single map to reflect commonality and differences in understanding and to generate new ideas. And then an affinity diagram is a technique that allows large numbers of ideas to be classified into groups for review and analysis. And I've got, let's see here. This is just an example that I pulled off the web of an affinity diagram. Okay. You have a large number of ideas. And what they've done is they've classified it into 5 different groups. Okay, so that's what you're going to be doing with an affinity diagram. Then mind mapping is where you come up with ideas and then group them. So it could, like you see here, it could be used for a vacation, can also be used to create new products. And as I said, these are just examples that are off the web. So nothing, no great shakes with any of those. But it's something that you may want to dig into. Okay. Observations, technique used to gain knowledge of a specific job role, task, or function in order to understand and determine project requirements. It's just when you're first involved, like when you're first involved with something, just walking around and talking with people and understanding what they're doing. Also facilitated workshops, organized working sessions held by project managers to determine what a project's requirements are, to get all stakeholders together to agree on the project's outcomes. The workshop really should provide some structure where you're going to have decisions being made and the outputs agreed upon. Also talk about context diagrams. So in this one, university is at the center, naturally, and then their interaction with government, private sector, industry, educational community, user community. Yeah. How is it going to be used? And what's going to be supplied? So here the request is for hardware, software, and support. What will be supplied is hardware, software, and support. Here, the government, you'll put in a request for funding, and the funding will come back to the university. Okay. So just take a look at where the arrowheads are here. And really, this is a fairly straightforward context diagram. Okay. Prototyping. It's a method of obtaining early feedback on requirements by providing a working model of the expected product before actually building it. In a software case, it's perhaps showing the user what they're going to see on the screens, with everything dummied up in the background, database, uh, control of external equipment, things like that. Having that not being done, but being able to show what it can do with the once all the interfaces have been accomplished. Okay. I told you I'd ask you around 6 o'clock here. We can either take a 10-minute break. We've got about 23 slides to go. Or we can power through and finish maybe a couple of minutes early. Can you raise your hand if you want the break at this point? And Will, you should be able to see who raises his or her hand.
Yeah, so far the chat room is overwhelmingly supporting power through.
Okay. All right. We can power through. If you need to leave for a few minutes, feel free to do so. You can always access the recording. Okay. Another technique is storyboarding. This is putting together pictures. It's a prototyping method. That can use visuals or images to illustrate a process or represent a project outcome. So that storyboarding is used extensively in industries such as movies, TV shows, things like that, to give an idea of what's going to be happening and what the outcomes can be. It's telling the story in pictures. Okay. We have requirements documentation, all kinds of documentation here. We have business requirements, stakeholder requirements, solution requirements, project requirements, transition requirements, and requirements, assumptions, dependencies, and constraints. So a lot of documentation at this point. Okay, we'll talk about the requirements management plan. So by definition, it's a component of the project or program management plan that describes how requirements will be analyzed, documented, and managed. They give you a list of the components, at least minimum. These will be included in the requirements management plan. Things such as how requirements activities will be planned, tracked, and reported. Configuration management activities, such as how version control of project documents and changes to the project will be initiated, how impacts will be analyzed, and how they will be traced, tracked, and reported, and what authorization level is required to approve these changes. So, configuration management is going to depend. What's done with this is it's going to depend on what type of project you have, whether it's predictive or whether it's an agile project. So that the version control, configuration management, and everything like that, it's going to be the same no matter what. I was looking at something else here. So configuration management is going to be the same. Requirements prioritization process defines how the project requirements will be analyzed and prioritized. This is the one that may change between predictive and agile. And then product metrics that we use and the rationale for using them. And really, you need to dig into this to make sure that the metrics are used in a positive way, not used for retribution if something isn't done as expected. And then traceability structure stating which requirements, attributes will be captured in the traceability matrix. And we're going to see an example of requirements traceability matrix here in this slide. Okay, this is for building a house. A one-car garage or 3 bedrooms, a bath and a half. You have to worry about landscaping, the driveway itself, passing all the inspections, seeing if you can use donated material and volunteer labor, how you're going to pay for it, and then how you're going to manage it. Okay. Now, if you have any questions, jump in too. Now, guidelines for collecting project requirements. Review the scope management plan, review the requirements management plan, review the stakeholder engagement plan, review the project charter, stakeholder register, then use tools and techniques such as interviews, focus groups, facilitated workshops, group creative techniques in order to collect the project requirements. Document the requirements in the requirements traceability matrix. So, going through the documents that you created earlier on is a good way to collect additional project requirements. Because no matter whether it's Agile or whether it's Waterfall, we want to have a really good idea of all the requirements that we can understand at this point in time, so that you can better predict the cost, the amount of time it's going to take, and how many people it's going to take. Okay. I also have the project scope statement. This is a description of the project scope, the major deliverables that make up the project, any of the assumptions or constraints that you're working on. The assumptions that you're using, and then the constraints that you've identified. So, say it's a government project, you have certain things that the project has to do, and you have to do them in a certain way. Okay, so that's a constraint if you've got a government project as opposed to a commercial project. It's a lot more liberal with a commercial. Okay. So scope, tools, and techniques, expert judgment, that's both internal or external. If it's important enough, you may want to bring in an industry expert. You need to analyze the alternatives, and the multi-criteria decision analysis means that you're not just looking for one criterion when you're going through and making decisions. You're going to be considering multiple criteria that may interact, so that you need to understand the product itself. If it's modification of something that's out there, you need to understand how the other product was created and what provisions have been made for any changes to that project. Okay. Facilitation is where someone who's trained can go in and really explore what some of the requirements need to be. And then product analysis. If there's a similar product in the marketplace, what makes it so great? So product analysis is a tool to define scope that generally means asking questions about a product and forming answers to describe the use characteristics and other relevant aspects of what's going to be manufactured. Going to look at product breakdown. So what components make up the product. Do some systems analysis. as to how it interfaces with other parts of the systems that you're going to have it working with. Requirements analysis, make sure that you've covered the requirements as best you can. Looking at it from a systems engineering aspect too, where it will have minimum impact to the stories or the requirements that we have to date. Take a systems engineering view of it too, so that you're raising your level of abstraction up, so that you're considering more and more the impact to other teams. Value engineering and value analysis. Now, what are your goals? Do you need to minimize costs? What's it going to cost for this thing to be produced? And what do you think the expected revenue is going to be? Okay. Now, guidelines to develop a project scope statement. You're going to want to review the scope management plan for the activities for developing, monitoring, and controlling a project scope. You want to keep a pretty good handle on that. You don't want the scope to run away. And at the same time, if the customer requires some sort of changes, you want to be able to accommodate those too. Also, you're going to review the project charter for the high-level project description and product characteristics, and project approval requirements. So, yeah, you need to understand who has to approve any changes, any further financial commitments. Does it have to be an officer of the company? Can it be your next level manager? You know, what parameters are in play here? So it's really valuable to document those, and in this case, review them at this time. Also review the requirements documentation. See what we documented before, make sure everything's relevant, and review the organizational process assets. Understand what the organization process brings to the table, and if there are any changes that need to be made. Going to want to use tools and techniques such as expert judgment, product analysis, alternative generation, and facilitated workshops to define the project scope. Okay. And then document the project scope statement and update any project documents as needed. The overall project management plan and the rest of the ones that we covered today. Work breakdown structure is a hierarchical decomposition of the total scope of work to be carried out by the project team to accomplish the project objectives and create the required deliverables. This shows a work breakdown structure, especially for a predictive project. With some Agile techniques, not going to have a complete work breakdown structure to start with. Part of it will be determined by the capabilities of each of the Scrum teams involved, or each of the teams involved, I should say, and what the current requirements are, what's currently on the backlog. So with Agile projects, you really want to work from a backlog, a prioritized backlog, and so that if a team finishes something early or they have to postpone something and they have the capabilities, they're able to just pull the next item off the backlog. So you'll see this mostly with, as I said, predictive type projects. Your WBS dictionary. Document that provides detailed deliverable activity and scheduling information about each component in the WBS. So it can include any of the following or all of the following. A code of account identifier. This is analogous to a PID for IT. It's a charge code. Can be for something that, say, construction. Description of work, assumptions and constraints. Should have a good handle on all of these. Responsible organization. It just, who is it? Your schedule milestones, your associated schedule activities, the resources you require to complete the work. It's both humans and or any capital equipment or non-capital equipment. The cost estimates, what they're based on. Any quality requirements, your acceptance criteria, and especially if it's an Agile project, your acceptance criteria should be for each of the user stories on up. Any technical references that were used to create the WBS, and any agreement that was made. Information about that, who was involved, why the decisions were made, things like that. Decomposition is a technique used for dividing and subdividing the project scope and project deliverables into smaller, more manageable parts. And you'll see this especially in Agile projects, because if you've got a 2-week increment where you're delivering things, you've got to have very small deliverables. Whatever you can do, create and test within a 2-week period is what you're dealing with. So classic requirements sometimes don't make the grade. You've got to break them down. Then control accounts. Control account is a management control point where the scope, budget, and actual cost and schedule are integrated and compared to earned value for performance management. This is taking a look at what you figured to spend, what you estimated that you'd receive at that time, and then doing the comparison with the actuals. Control accounts are associated with different work packages and verified against the earned value to check performance. If you're ahead of the earned value, if you've spent, if you've actually earned more value, then that's good. Remember? And then work packages are assigned a control account. Work will be managed within that account throughout the project. They'll so that each of the work packages would be assessed one or more times throughout the life of the project. And then control accounts can contain more than one work package, but each work package is assigned to only one control account. Right? So that you can group work packages together to do this analysis, especially if they depend on each other. You don't do this multiple times for each work package. The work package is only assigned to one control account. And planning packages, work breakdown structure component below the control account with known work content but without detailed schedule activities. Okay, so if you've got a package out there, it gives you a good wet-fingered guess about where it should reside and what the scope is of that. You don't have in all the components, but you don't have the detailed breakdown done yet. So you're going to anticipate having um, subordinate parts of your WBS coming off of there. In your code of accounts, the numbering system used to uniquely identify each component of the WBS. Scope baseline is the approved version of the scope statement, work breakdown structure, and its associated WBS dictionary. It can be changed using formal change control procedures and is used as a basis for comparison to actual results. The change control process is usually very formal if it's a predictive type project. Agile projects can have a change control process, but mostly it's negotiation with the customer and reprioritizing the backlog that accounts for any of the change control. Your scope baseline components can include the project scope statement, the work breakdown structure, work package, any planning packages, and the WBS dictionary. Then guideline to create a WBS. This is basically the process that you follow. Review the scope management plan and the project scope statement. You review the requirements documentation, reviewing the EEFs and OPAs, use tools and techniques such as decomposition, use expert judgment, include notes on work products that might be delivered incrementally, and then document the scope baseline. Within AT&T, especially on the software side, we have predefined work breakdown structures for predictive and for agile efforts. So if you get outside of AT&T or get outside of AT&T IT, you may need to do everything here. Okay. Differentiation between product and iteration backlogs. Product backlog, you need to know these definitions. It's essentially a list of the expected work needed to deliver the product. Okay. Product backlog changes throughout the project, and grooming and refining the product backlog is an ongoing exercise, typically scheduled in weekly or monthly intervals. You also need to assess that whenever you've completed an iteration or a sprint. Product backlog items, PBIs, drop off when the work is completed. PBIs are edited and clarified as more knowledge becomes apparent or as product requirements change. PBIs are continually added as necessary when more work must be done. And then the iteration backlog includes items from the product backlog that can conceivably be completed within the time period based on the team's capacity. It's also on the team's capabilities too. If you've got, for the overall deliverables, you've got to build a road and produce some software. I don't think you want the software engineers out there trying to build a road, and I don't think you want the construction civil engineers to be trying to create all the software necessary. And teams must estimate the effort size of the work and understand the priorities of the business. Within, say, a SAFe, which is Scaled Agile paradigm, the effort size of the work and understanding the priorities of the business. The priorities of the business are handled by a product owner so that you have direct access to the business itself. So you need them to be really involved with defining what the backlog is and prioritizing that backlog. As I said, there are several techniques of doing that. One you may hear of is one I call WSJF, weighted shortest job first. Okay, we have user stories, and this is an Agile environment. Noting that projects deliver value. User stories help teams focus on that value provided to the user. So what you're really defining here is, from the customer's perspective, what does this product have to do? Not how it does it, but just what it needs to do. Okay. And then user stories frame who is to benefit from the work of the team, who's targeted for this, which customer, what type of customer. And then they do frame the user's desire as a story instead of a detailed requirement or a specification. And that enables the team to focus on the user and what they value. So you need to have the user's perspective represented here very accurately and consistently. Okay. Good user stories have a perspective that who's going to be using it, what are they going to be doing with it, and if there are any constraints such as when they need it. If there's a physical constraint like that, you want that documented in the user story. Now, tools and techniques for verifying the scope, definition of done, and they describe that as a team's checklist of all the criteria required to be met so that a deliverable can be considered ready for customer use. This can be an external customer, or it can be an internal customer. As I said before, a definition of done is an agreement between any two teams. Okay. So that if you've got a team that interfaces with the end customer and interfaces with the development team, you need a definition of done for the overall effort, and you need a definition of done also for when the development team will be able to take a handoff of from the team that interfaces with the customer. Definition of ready is similar. It's a team's checklist for a user-centric requirement that has all the information the team needs to be able to begin working on that particular deliverable, for that particular requirement. Okay. You need acceptance criteria. Set of conditions that's required to be met before deliverables are accepted. In Agile projects, you're going to need to include the acceptance criteria up front. A lot of times, the acceptance criteria are used to build test cases. And some test cases, testing that is part of a regression test plan, things like that. So that it's really critical to get clear, concise acceptance criteria. Need to validate scope, process of formalizing acceptance of completed project deliverables. That's it, anytime there's a major deliverable. Iteration reviews, at or near the conclusion of the time-boxed iteration. Now, that could be a 2-week interval, it could be a 3-week interval. Within Scaled Agile, you also have what are called program increments, which are about 20 weeks, 18 weeks long. At the end of that, you want to be able to assess and do a review. You want to be able to do things like midpoint also. Okay. Variance analysis, technique for determining the cause and degree of difference between the baseline and actual performance. Trend analysis is an analytical technique that uses mathematical models to forecast future outcomes based on historic results. So what you're going to take a look at is what's happened in the past and make an assessment or use the analysis based on that. What's worked before. You have to really take that with a grain of salt at times, especially if you're producing something innovative that could disrupt an entire market. This is not appropriate in every case, but there are cases where it is very appropriate. Okay. We don't have an activity. Okay. So our learning goals were to assess project needs, complexity, and magnitude to determine the appropriate project methodology, methods, and practices. Plan and manage the scope, plan and manage the budget and resources, plan, prepare, modify, and manage the project schedule based on the methodology chosen, plan and manage the quality of products and deliverables, integrate project planning activities, plan and manage procurement strategy, establish the project governance structure, and plan and manage project phase closure. That's for this series. Okay. So things to think about, not necessarily right now, but before the next class. Two things. Why do you think developing project and scope management plans is important? And why do you think it's important to collect requirements, define scope, and create a work breakdown structure? It's just a couple of things to think about. And, based on anything that you've learned today, see if you can, just jot down some thoughts about this. And if you want, we can cover some of those in the next session. It's this Wednesday. Okay. That's it. Okay, any questions?
I haven't received any, Harry. There's nothing in the chat room, and I don't have anything by queue or email. So, of course, everyone's free to ask some questions live if they'd like to.
Yep. Should I have set an alarm for like 6:15? Okay. I'd like to thank everybody for participating today. And best of luck on the exam when you take it. And hopefully we'll see all of you and maybe some more on Wednesday for the second portion of this.
Thank you, Harry.
Well,
don't forget to close up. Yeah, don't forget to close up the recording, Harry. Just heads up.
Yep. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Talk to you on Wednesday.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
More than welcome.